Could news of a dirty bomb being built in Kiev be real or an excuse for Russia to launch an escalated attack on Ukraine? If Ukraine is losing the war, might U.S. troops be suiting up to join forces in an actual attack on Russia? Was NATO's strategy in Ukraine a later-day version of the Afghanistan war to collapse the Soviet Union in the 1980s? How fundamentally has the war changed the map for Europe, the US, and the world? This week on the Global Research News Hour, we bring you the latest news from the site of war in Ukraine. In our first half hour, we'll hear from Colonel Douglas McGregor about his predictions for how the war in Ukraine is going better for Russia than the media is letting on, and how a new escalation in war violence could arrive as soon as November. Right now, as tensions begin to develop in Ukraine, it's my privilege to have with me Colonel Douglas McGregor. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and a government official. He was a former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and he's been outspoken in many interviews against the current narrative surrounding the Russian attack on Ukraine, and joins us now to comment on recent actions and the direction the war may be headed. It's a pleasure to host you here, Colonel McGregor. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, there's currently a lot of talk that the Russian government released information about a dirty bomb being used by the Ukrainians as a false attack, flag attack. It's a conventional explosives with radioactive material. What kind of evidence do you know of that substantiates such a claim?
Well, about 3 weeks ago, President Zelensky, according to the Ukrainian media, as spokesman for the Ukrainian media, announced that he was directing the establishment of a cell consisting of engineers and scientists, Ukrainians, of course, and that they were going to work on a quote-unquote dirty bomb development. And as you point out, the so-called dirty nuclear bomb involves the use of conventional explosives with spent uranium from a conventional nuclear power plant. This uranium is not weapons grade. That is, it's not plutonium, it's not enriched, but it can be used in combination with a conventional explosive to effectively contaminate a very large area that could result in people becoming very ill with radiation poisoning or worse. Now, this was roughly 3-4 weeks ago. This was not the first time that President Zelensky has brought up the issue of nuclear weapons. Last year, long before this war even started, he raised issues about arming Ukraine with nuclear weapons. These kinds of things were largely ignored, but he mentioned it again in January, and the Russians made it clear that if a nuclear weapon was used against them, they would retaliate. But Putin has said from the very beginning that the Russians have no intention of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine or anywhere in Eastern Europe. And they've said, he personally has said that several times, and that nuclear weapons are purely retaliatory. Now, recently, the Russians have become concerned because they say they've detected real evidence for the effort to build such a weapon. I have no idea. I do know, though, the following. First of all, Ukraine is not only losing this war, Ukraine is very close to collapse, the very opposite of what you're hearing through the Western media. And I think as a result, they're extremely desperate. And one act of desperation would be to use such a weapon in proximity to Russian troops. And that would mean somewhere in southern Ukraine, because the area the Russians now control is an area inhabited overwhelmingly by Russians, not Ukrainians. And these areas are now formally annexed to Russia. So I would assume that somewhere in the south, if such a weapon existed, that's where they would try to use it. But again, I don't know any more than, frankly, you do regarding the efficacy of these statements. But the Russians took it seriously enough that the Russian Minister of Defense called the Secretary of Defense in the United States, as well as the British Minister of Defense and the Turkish Minister of Defense, and expressed his concern and said whatever he did about the potential for such a weapon to be used.
Well, just I should point out that there was a joint statement by the foreign ministers of France, the UK, and the US saying that the governments, quote, all reject Russia's transparently false allegations that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb on its own territory, unquote. It's stressing that they could continue supporting Ukraine in, quote, the face of President Vladimir Putin's brutal war of aggression, unquote. And of course, the NATO Secretary General has warned Russia over its false claim that Kiev might use a dirty bomb, conventional explosives, in radioactive material. And he tweeted that Russia may not use it as a pretext for escalation. So I guess I'm wondering, because I think you said in recent in recent interviews that there's an attack by Russia could materialize in the next couple of weeks, I believe. So I guess I'm wondering, first of all, how you would refute the claims of the Western representatives, and then also maybe comment on the kind of escalation that Jens Stoltenberg and others anticipate.
Well, first of all, Russia has always enjoyed escalation dominance in this conflict. The Russians initially went in with a very small force, less than 20% of their ground force. They went in on a very broad front in very small groups of battalion-size organizations. That's 800-900 men. And the objective was to minimize damage to civilian infrastructure, minimize loss of civilian life, frankly. They went in that way with the assumption that there would be negotiations, because at the time what they were asking for was recognition of the rights of the Russian citizens. This is something they've asked repeatedly in the Minsk Accords. They were asking for it again in the context of the two so-called breakaway republics in the East. And they wanted recognition for the legitimate ownership of Crimea by Moscow. Now, these things were rejected out of hand. And of course, the demand for Ukrainian neutrality was rejected. But towards the end of April, after meeting in Istanbul, there was an attempt by Zelensky to say, look, we could live with neutrality and we'll discuss the rest. That was suddenly squashed. And over the next 2 months, I think the Russian general staff kept arguing for a much larger and more decisive operation. And again, President Putin was unwilling to go there, but did agree that they would go in and protect the Russians living in southern Ukraine. One of the reasons initially that the Russians living in Ukraine stayed away from the Russian forces entering the country was that the Russians had always said that they would leave once they had successfully destroyed Ukrainian armed forces. So the Russian attitude inside eastern Ukraine was, well, if you're going to leave, then we're not going to cooperate with you, because if we do, we'll all be shot and killed by the Ukrainian secret police after you leave. This changed, and President Putin altered the parameters of the operation, said, no, we will stay now, we will protect you, and that's what the Russians have done. At the same time, the Ukrainians, of course, have launched hundreds of counterattacks in which they've lost 10, 20, 30, 40,000 lives over the last few months, just devastating losses. And we continue to report that Russia is defeated and Russia is finished. And whenever the Russians have raised anything with us about the possibility of negotiations, the possibility of coming to some sort of ceasefire, we've rejected it. As a result, Putin announced this 300,000 man reservist mobilization. And it's very clear now that groups of Russian forces numbering over 500,000 have assembled in Western Russia, southern Ukraine, and in Belarus. So an offensive, a major conventional, what we would call a high-end conventional offense is coming in November and December. Precisely when, I don't know, but I think it depends very heavily on the weather, because right now the ground is still very muddy. They've had lots of rain. They'll wait until the ground freezes, because that obviously affords mobility. In the meantime, to show you just how badly things are going for the Ukrainians, they have no power. The electrical grid has been devastated. They have been unable to move forces on the railroads except with the use of diesel engines. and I'm informed that those diesel engines are being found, targeted, and destroyed. At the same time, the Ukrainians have now withdrawn their armor, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, because they don't have the fuel to move them, which puts the Ukrainians in a position of attacking either on foot or using things we call technicals, in other words, pickup trucks with automatic cannon. And the counterattacks themselves have been reduced from, say, 40 or 50,000 at a time, directed at a specific point where they dramatically outnumber the Russians, to 10,000, down to 5,000, now down to 1,200, and in some cases only a few hundred. So the Ukrainian forces have lost at least 100,000 soldiers killed, probably have another 300,000 or 400,000 wounded, maybe more. Their situation is dire. And the more dire it becomes, the more likely they are going to look for ways to drag the United States and anyone else in NATO that they can drag into the war. And that's the real danger at this point, that we will be seduced into joining the war on the ground conventionally, something which President Bush said would not happen. But there are more and more indicators that that very definitely could happen. And that would be devastating, because the Russian assault that's coming is going to be much closer to what most of us predicted would have happened back in February, which is a very devastating attack with all the weapon systems at their disposal, and near simultaneously with ground forces advancing in great numbers. We're not prepared for that. We don't have the numbers of forces to sustain an operation against them. So I hope that this is not going to happen. But given General Petraeus's remarks the other day, I think he was setting up a trial balloon and indicating that, yes, we could actually have a quote unquote coalition of the willing. And that would probably include Poles and Romanians, because the rest of the NATO members really want nothing to do with the war against Russia.
Wow. Well, I'll return back to the issue of U.S. forces going back in a minute. But I mean, you were saying that Ukraine is clearly losing, yet what we hear in the press, and I don't think this is fabricating necessarily, is that they're making advances and Russia's pulling back. You know, they're that Putin's pushed into a corner and may respond with, a nuclear attack or no one knows what. But I mean, could you maybe correct the reports, or at least is Russia's just going to move forward at some point in November or December to retake the positions that were lost to them?
First of all, Russia hasn't lost any positions. The only area from which they have actually withdrawn was the area around and east of Kharkov, which is flat and open. And they simply decided that they would withdraw. They had only 2,000 troops up there. And when the Ukrainians attacked with 40,000, they withdrew those forces. And then they directed artillery, airstrikes, rocket artillery, conventional artillery, and killed about 40%, 30 to 40% of the attacking Ukrainian force. Ukrainians have been held there ever since and have made no further progress. Otherwise, Ukrainians have taken nothing that has not been taken back. On the other hand, there are some areas where the Russians simply decided that there was no good defensible terrain. And so they've moved from one area to another, distance of perhaps 3, 4, 5 miles, sometimes 10 miles, to a better position, which afforded them the fields of fire that they needed for effective defense. The audience needs to understand that you're fighting a war in something that's close to western Kansas as you approach the border with Colorado. There simply isn't much terrain out there of any real significance. So it doesn't make sense to hold on to ground that offers no advantage. I think that's what's happened. The West is trying, through the media with its information campaign, which is a very effective information campaign, to create the illusion that something good is happening for Ukraine and something bad for Russia. There's no evidence for that. The Russians haven't been hurt by any of this. Economically, we've been hurt. Europe has been hurt, but not Russia. And the Russian military has never really been committed in great numbers and in the way that we normally would expect to see them committed. And that's what you're going to see happen sometime in November and December. And I think that's going to be a very devastating offensive. I don't think Ukraine will survive it. I think the Ukrainian state and its armed forces will frankly collapse. So I would just tell people that They are targets of a very brilliant psychological operation run by Washington and London across Europe, the United States, and anywhere else they can get in to convince people of things that are simply not true. And that's about it. You know, Leon Trotsky, the old Bolshevik, was approached in 1920 when he was running the show inside the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And one of his comrades said, you know, we can't publish what you want to publish. It's just not true. Trotsky smiled and said, look, paper will put up with anything you put on it. And I think what people have learned here in the West is that cable television, satellite TV, radio, whatever, will certainly put up with whatever you put on it. And that's also true for the internet. And so if you flood the airways with enough lies, frequently enough, redundantly and repetitively, eventually people assume it's true. And what I'm trying to tell you is it's not true. And we're about to get an education in November and December. And I think it would be very unwise of Washington to involve itself in any way directly with the Russian military when it conducts these offensive operations.
Now, you mentioned the prospect of American forces actually going in. I know that there are midterm elections right now that might affect how America ultimately engages the Russia-Ukraine war. It's just like under 2 weeks now, and I'm wondering, first of all, how would they actually get the I should mention that there's no interest whatsoever in talking about the U.S. going in there right now, because as with Vietnam, they committed billions of dollars to this Ukraine operation while people are, there's inflation, the food costs a lot, gasoline costs a lot. So I'm wondering how you see that step being taken. I mean, is it something that will happen regardless of how the midterms go forward? How can you see them actually executing that maneuver?
You're talking about Washington and what it may do, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make that clear. Well, first of all, I'm pretty good at a number of things. I'm very comfortable talking about military affairs in Europe, what's likely, what the Russians will do, and what the Ukrainians are doing. I grew up with large numbers of Ukrainians and Poles, and I studied in Europe for years, and I'm very familiar with Russia and its interests and its military. I, on the other hand, am not a very good domestic political analyst. I don't know what's going to happen during the midterms. My suspicion is that the Republican Party will probably win the House. It may or may not win the Senate. Who knows? Whether or not that really makes any difference is anybody's guess. Based upon my experience thus far, I haven't seen much evidence for a great change, regardless of who ends up in power in Washington. But I would say the following, that if you are committed ideologically, and that's what we're dealing with right now, the people running our government are not Americans in the traditional sense. In other words, these are not practical people. These are not pragmatic people who are willing to do whatever works and are interested preeminently in prosperity and avoiding war. Historically, that's what we Americans have been interested in for most of our history since 1776. These people actually want a confrontation with Russia, and they see Russia as this enormous obstacle to the utopian world they think they want to create, along with the World Economic Forum and others of that ilk. So if you're interested in that, I think that you have an incentive to act before November 8th, because if you wait until after November 8th, you may end up, you can't be certain, you may end up with a Congress that won't support you in what you want to do. Whereas right now, since the White House effectively controls both houses, you saw that happen with the so-called left-wing Democrats who stood up and said, we think it's time to talk with Russians, and how they rapidly retreated from that position when they were challenged by the White House. They think that the best time to act would be now as opposed to later, because you might have growing numbers of Republicans and Democrats who are uncomfortable with the war, and they're also dealing with all the other issues that you mentioned. And so if you want to do this, you better act sooner rather than later. That's my concern. And you have Petraeus who's talking about this so-called coalition of the willing. And I know that people in Europe, if you just go on the internet, go on YouTube, if you can get it before YouTube eliminates the videos, and see the numbers of people in Romania, for instance, that are demonstrating against NATO and against the presence of the 101st Air Mobile Division in their country. See the demonstrations in Paris, in Germany, in the Czech Republic. Everywhere that you look, you see opposition to war with Russia. No one wants to be at war with Russia. The Europeans would like this to end since they're the ones that are going to suffer the most as a consequence. We are driving this train. So again, if you listen to Petraeus, who I think is just running a trial balloon for the administration, and he talks about this coalition of the willing, and right now that looks like it's probably the Poles, who have a government that is fanatically anti-Russian, that wants to attack the Russians, along with the Romanians, who may or may not be terribly excited, but have probably been pressured by us to join. That would be your coalition of the willing, because the British really have almost nothing to send to Ukraine to fight. They could send a few thousand, but I don't know whether or not the new government in Britain would be anxious to do that. The French they're tied down in Africa. There's not much they can send. So there's not much that the European NATO members can contribute. So you go in with some number, maybe 150,000 Romanian, Polish, and American forces. If that happens, then we will be at war with Russia and Ukraine. And I don't think the American people have any appetite for that. And the American people, Michael, as you know, are not really following this very carefully because they have serious problems of their own here at home that are far more important to them. And that's the problem. A minority of people are in control of your government. They are ideologues, and they are committed to this war. And they are not asking for a declaration of war. They are simply telling Congress, this is what I want you to do. And Congress is being rewarded with whatever it wants financially if it goes along with this war policy. It's a very dangerous situation. I hope it doesn't come to that. But if they wait until after 8 November, then they're very, very much in danger of being steamrollered. So I think they're probably going to try and act before then. That's not going to change the outcome. It's still not going to be good for us. But I see that as a possibility.
Colonel McGregor, it's been a pleasure having you on my show. Thank you so much for your analysis and thoughts.
All right, Michael. Thank you. Bye-bye.